What's going on, guys? So it's Mazda Monday, and as you can see, video's a little different. I'm not on the couch today. So we are on part 2 of our testing of the parts that don't do anything. So the video is going to be short today because this is going to be a 4 to 5 part series. The first modification we did after our stock runs were the spark plugs. But before we talk about the spark plugs, let's just talk about our first runs. Okay, so we did, probably 20 runs, practice runs before we started our actual testing. We did this in Texas. It was in Odessa, Texas, which the elevation is 3,000 feet. It was about 100 plus degrees out there. So when we were doing the draggy runs, the DA, which is the elevation simulation, so what it actually feels like, it was at 10,000 feet. So when we initially did this testing, before we started everything, I changed the air filter and I reflashed a stock tune to give the car the best chance possible to run good times while it's on 91 octane, right? So the car, as you heard, it learns, and what it really does is it increases timing until it gets to a point of knock, and then it stops increasing timing. So anyways, the car's on the stock tune or on my tune, as it's learning, it's gonna get faster as it keeps checking for knock. It's gonna keep running its checks, and if there's no issues, no knock, the car is gonna keep, increasing power a little bit until a certain point. All right, and that's all based off knock corrections and your base timing tables. All right, so when we did our first runs, which I'm gonna show you a little bit of stuff in the videos, the stock car with stock tune ran an average of 6.7 seconds, or not 6.7, 9.7 seconds. I know it should be in the sixes, but it ran 9.7 seconds with a DA of 10,000 feet, right? So that was our average. One run was 9.67, one was 9.76. So we averaged out at about 9.7. Did 4 runs, and that was our average. So then after that, keep in mind, this car has only been on the stock tune. It's never been tuned before. Then after that, we flashed the sauce tune. It's like a base tune. I do have a faster tune that he is gonna get later. So when we did the runs, we had a run. The first run, it was, I believe it was 9.4. Then we did a 9.2, and then we ended up running a 9.05. All right. So our average time when we did the tune, we ran a 9.15. That was like our average. So we improved about a half a second, 0 to 60 with just the tune alone. And you have to remember, we're at an elevation of it's not the actual elevation, but we're at an elevation of 3,000 feet, but with the weather, it simulates 10,000 feet. So we were able to change the time a half a second just with a tune. And if you want to actually find out, there's a DA calculator, what the times would have been like at sea level. If it made a half a second difference at that 10,000 feet, at sea level, the difference is going to be even bigger than 0.5 seconds, because you have more air. There's going to be a bigger difference because there's more horsepower increase at sea level. So just with that alone, we got a half second from the tune. All right. So when I do the calculations, this probably still won't equal a whole second difference with 0 to 60. So, and that's where the parts come in. So let's talk about the first modification we did. So as you know, we did stock run 4 times, then we did tuned run 4 times, completely stock car. The next thing I did, and I wanted to test this because I never really do this because, you know, a lot of cars are modified, and I always tell people to do this. And I really want to see one time what would happen if I didn't properly do what I was supposed to when it came to installing parts. So, you know, I left the tune, my sauce tune on the car. And usually what you want to do is, after you install any part on the car, you want to reset the ECU by either disconnecting the battery or using a code reader, or you use your Mazda edit to reset the parameters and all the learned parameters, right? So if you do not reset the parameters, you're gonna run into issues, all right? So I'm gonna show you in this little clip what happened. You can actually hear it, all right? 2000 first run with the spark plugs and tune, and then we'll switch back to the stock file to see if there's any learned differences. All right, here we go. First time he spun the tires was that last run. So what happened in the video, if you just saw, there was a loud pinging noise. That's detonation, all right? So I installed those spark plugs without resetting the ECU, which is via battery or like a scan tool or your Mazda edit. So what happened was the car already had a learned parameter because I already did runs on that tune, right? And then all of a sudden I changed the spark plugs that had a different resistance in it. So now what I want to show you is on this chart. So just show you a couple things. So these I took a multimeter right here, and I went and I checked the resistance on my stock spark plugs that I had in my car that I changed out at 30,000 miles. I checked the resistance on the test car, which were at 78,000 miles, and you're supposed to change the spark plugs at 75,000 miles. And then I also tested my fake Honda plugs resistance, all right? So, and also checked the GTR plugs before I put them in his car. So I have all the resistance numbers of all those spark plugs, and they're on my whiteboard I just purchased here. So, as you can see, so the stock plugs are supposed to have a resistance of 5,000 ohms, and they say you can be with plus or minus 1,000's okay, but you want to be close to 5 as possible, right? So if you look here, you can see my reading. So on average with the stock plugs, you got about 4,000 ohm resistance, right? Not bad, you know, they're all within that 1,000, nothing crazy. Now we go over to the test car, 78,000 miles. You're supposed to change them at 75 on the stock car. You look down here, you got one that's at 4.5, which is within reason, you know, one at 4.61. That's within OEM specs. And then you get down here, you got these two. One is at 6.10, and then the other resistance is almost double of these other spark plugs. So you have almost an 8 ohm resistance when manufacturer specs is supposed to be at 5,000. Plus or minus 1,000 is okay, but you got 8 ohms of resistance, right? The car will adjust to spark plugs over time, but the issue was when I put in the GTR plugs, as you can see here, the average was 4 ohms, 4,000 ohms. So that is the resistance. That's a 4K resistance. And this one has a 6K and an 8K resistance almost. All right, so what happened was the car, it calibrated to this, right? So when I changed them to these plugs, 2 of these spark plugs that are in here are registering at a 4K, and this is registering at a 6 and an 8. So the spark plugs give feedback are used as feedback to the coils, and the coil gives feedback to the ECU. Now the problem is we're gonna go over this. I'm gonna erase this whiteboard, and we're gonna go over the issue with not resetting the ECU, right? So I noticed when cars did not reset the ECU and their coils, like when you don't have a tune, if your coil resistance was higher and you put a lower resistant, or your spark plug resistance was higher and you put a lower resistance spark plugs, what ends up happening is your car increases ignition timing, right? Because normally it's used to seeing this value, and then when you decrease, ignition timing goes up. So in the video, you can hear the ignition timing going up, but it went up so high that the car started having knock. And also tested my fake plugs, and the resistance on these is very low, except for one plug. All the resistance is very low, below 4K, which you don't want that. And we're going to talk about the problems, why it's bad to have too low of a resistance. All right, lower resistance on a stock car without changing the parameters is going to give you more timing, but that's bad in a lot of aspects. And we're going to talk about that in a second here. So I'm going to go ahead and erase this whiteboard. As you can see, yeah, you can see that the two of these spark plugs, the resistance went up a lot over that 78K miles. Now, we're going to talk about placement of spark plugs. Like if you do want to read them and put them in the correct, like the best beneficial position, we're going to talk about that. Especially you guys with cylinder deactivation, you have to remember your car is going to, part of the time use the center two cylinders more than the outside cylinders, right? And over time, when the plugs are getting old, the resistance is going to increase, right? And the spark plugs that are being used the most are going to have more increase in resistance. So what you want to do is when you get your set of 4 spark plugs, you're going to want to put the 2 plugs with the lowest resistance on the 2 center cylinders with the deactivation, because also the 2 cylinders in the center get hotter. So the more heat cycles those spark plugs go through, the more resistance they're going to build. So it's beneficial to have the coil or the spark plugs with the lower resistance on the cylinder deactivation cylinders that are functioning, because that's going to give them a better chance to stay even over the life of the spark plugs before you have to change them. Okay, I was going to erase the whiteboard, but I don't think it's time for that yet. So what we're going to do is, I don't really want to teach you guys how to tune, because, that's my thing. But I do also want to show you in the ECU why the spark plugs will affect performance, and what kind of things that we look for. So I'm not a self-made guy. There's people on forums that gave away free information. I had my tuner, Raf, who, he never gave me his tunes, but he also kind of told me how to go about tuning, right? And then also his boss, Matt, who's the OG OVT tuner, he was always posting back in the day on Facebook, and I would screenshot of a lot of his stuff, and kind of keep it in the back of my mind until I get to the point where I couldn't figure out more things with tuning, and I started just rereading things that he had wrote in the forums or on Facebook, and I found more ways to get power, and I understood the ignition timing tables a little bit better. And what I want to do is kind of, this is stuff that you can go on your own and read on Google. I'll leave links at the bottom. but the resistance of your spark plugs are very important, all right? There's one thing that a lot of people don't really know about the resistance. Like let me tell you my background. So before, when I was in high school, I used to install sound systems, right? And so what's very important when you're installing sound systems is, the resistance, like for your load. Obviously people focus on voltage. So I've been in the electronic field a while, dealing with resistance, and voltage and amperage, right? So if you guys know, some of you might have installed sound systems, usually when you have, subwoofers and all that, you'll have like a 2 ohm through an 8 ohm load. So your load or your resistance is going to be a number, right? And the lower the resistance, the more current flow that's going to pass through, right? And you don't want too much current flow, because then it draws a lot of power, right? So your resistance is a restrictor of how much energy flow can go through. So you want to limit it to where you can always keep a constant flow and never lower the resistance so much that the energy flow is so much that is causing too much heat to be released and the system not being able to keep up with the amount of flow that is going out, which can cause burnouts and everything else. So when I was installing stereos, a big thing was making sure you have the correct load, which is your resistance, your ohms. A lot of times, people, you can wire things in parallel or in a series. When you wire things in a series, you increase the resistance, because you're increasing the distance that the electrons and your protons, their circulation, have to travel in order to get through the system. When you wire things at parallel, which means now you're having like double the flow, you're lowering the resistance because there's an easier path for the electricity to flow. It's an easier path to ground things. So don't want to get too technical. We have a charging system in our car, right? We have our alternator and our battery, and that alternator helps generate the current that goes to our coils, and our coils fire our spark plugs, right? If we don't have enough resistance in the spark plug, there's too much current flowing through and it's drawing a lot of power. And when there's a lot of power to draw, there's a lot of heat generated, right? So if you have an ignition coil and every time the spark plug is firing, there's a lot of heat and amperage going through it, that coil is going to heat up, right? So that's why we put a resistance on the spark plug, so that not too much current can flow at all one time, because the more current that flows, the more heat that's going to build up. So we have this resistance to keep the current flow at a certain amount, right? If you drop that resistance down to a 2 ohm, now every time that spark fires, more current is going to flow through there. Now, when that happens, that puts a lot of strain on the coil pack, because now the coil has to keep regenerating current, right? Every time it fires, it has to put out that same amount of current, which is a lot, all right? So let me show you something in Mazda Edit. So here's this table. This is called, ignition dwell, right? So as your voltage drops, you need a longer time to charge the coil to get enough charge to fire, right? Sorry about that for a second. But anyways, what I'm trying to say is, you'll need higher voltage. The higher the voltage you have, the less time you need to charge up the coil, right? But if you drop the load, what's going to end up happening is going to draw more energy, right? and that's going to cause a lot of strain on the coil. So what ends up happening is the coil is going to need more time to charge in between its firing, right? So you want to make sure you don't have too low of resistance, because now the coil needs more time to charge in between its firing, and the more it has to charge and the higher the energy that is traveling, the hotter that coil is going to get, and what's going to end up happening is you're going to burn out that coil pack. All right, so that's just ignition dwell. I don't want to get too much into that. It's kind of lame. It's for, you know, guys that like electronics. They'll know about all this type of stuff. So we'll leave that alone. Let's go into the next thing about these cars and how they learn. So if you look in here, there's this thing called ignition timing, knock correction learning, right? So there's these values in here. I don't 100% know how to translate this the correct way, but these values, like, so if your car was to knock, this is the minimum amount of, and you can read it right here, this is the minimum amount of timing that the car will pull if it hears knock. So it has to pull 1.65 degrees if there is a knock event. All right. And that's on the NA car and on the turbo car. It will have to pull, if there's actually a knock event, it will pull minimum 1.65 degrees of timing, which, you know, is almost 5 to 10 horsepower. And then there's this, which is your knock correction maximum, meaning if, say, there was knock or whatever, after you're going through your learning cycle, the car can add some timing back in, which it can't even add a whole degree. You know, it's going to add that much based on if there's no knock events. It'll add like almost a degree of timing back in, like half of this. All right. So at least that's what my understanding of it is. I might not be correct, but that's how I look at it. And so then we'll go over here, and I want to just show you this table. Let me get my mouse here. All right, so this is a turbo table, and this is a naturally aspirated table. So we're going to look at these two tables, and this table is ignition knock correction. Now, I've been trying to study these tables a lot because these are the only like really ignition tables, or the knock correction tables that look different between the NA model and the turbo model, right? And what I'm noticing is that on this NA model, the degree of knock correction is only 0.875, whereas you go on the turbo model, the highest degree of knock correction is 1.5. And I believe this is not a negative number, it's a positive number. So what this is telling me in my head is, you know how the turbo model, it can increase power. If you go from 87 to 93, it increases power. Well, I believe that power increase happens to deal with this table right here, because this car, in a car, it'll only gain this much timing, whereas this car, it'll gain 1.5 degrees of timing, which is worth a lot more power. At least that's what this table looks like to me. I haven't touched these tables, but these are knock correction tables, and I feel like this is around what I would adjust if, you know, I was going from 87 to 93. No, I'm not 100% positive on it, but this could possibly be a table dealing with that, and that's why this value in this table is so much more. All right, so I mean, look at all these knock correction tables in here. All right, and so that's why when people talk about learning, these cars do learn, and so we'll talk more about that in a second. All right, sorry about the squeaky chair, guys. So, yeah, we're continuing to talk about knock. So, what I'm really trying to get at with this whole spark plug thing and knock correction. Let's go ahead and erase the whiteboard because I want to just really break it down Borny style so I can show you what I'm talking about. When I installed the spark plugs, we got that ignition timing knock, right? And that was because I didn't reset the parameters. Because in that, on the original spark plugs, there was a resistance of 8 and a 6. So the coils, that was its learned parameters, right? And then I changed the resistance to 4 versus the 8. So now what happened was the coil in its mind with a 8 ohm load, it advanced timing as far as it felt safe with that amount of resistance, right? And then when I lowered that resistance, it thought it could go higher. So let me kind of put this in perspective with the ignition timing and the resistance, right? So the car is gonna use feedback to determine the amount of ignition timing, right? So the coil communicates with the ECU and tells it, hey, based off this baseline, this is how much timing we should be using safely, right? Each of the coils, actually with the spark plugs, has its own, resistance. Like they had different numbers in there, and they all use their own separate baseline based off the resistance of that spark plug. So let's just say our spark plug has a 4 ohm load, like a 4K ohm load, right? And at 4K load, we have 4 degrees of ignition timing. It's just a hypothetical number to make this easy to understand. So let's say we got 4K ohms, right? And this is the resistance of our coil, or not our coil, our spark plug, right? So we got a 4K ohm load with our spark plug, right? And let's just say with our 4K ohm load, when we're launching at 2000 RPM, we get 4 degrees of ignition timing. So let's just say this is timing. Let me redo that. That was very sloppy. So we got 4K equals 4 degrees of timing. All right, so with a 4 ohm load, we got 4 degrees of timing, right? Let's just say that's our base equivalent, right? And we decided to put in the fake GTR spark plugs with the 2K resistance, right? So this is like a 1-to-1 ratio, right? So every ohm of resistance is equal to 1 degree of timing, right? So say we drop this down to 2 ohms, right? Now we put in this fake coil without resetting the ECU, and it thinks this is its baseline. It's going off of this 4K ohm, and we don't reset the ECU with our battery or our scan tool. What ends up happening if you do a 2K ohm load, what's gonna happen? The car is gonna have read less resistance, and it's gonna advance ignition timing. So now instead of it having 4 degrees, it's gonna try to advance to almost 6 degrees. So now it went to 6 degrees of timing. And it went to 6 degrees of timing because the resistance is lower, right? And this is without resetting the ECU. And same thing applies if you would go up in resistance. Instead of this being 4 degrees, it's gonna drop down to 3 or 2. Now, when your car is running, this number is going to go up. So right now, when the plugs are cold, they're 4 ohms. When the car is operating, it's going to heat up, and when things heat up, the resistance goes up. So even though this is 4 kilo ohms when it's cold, when it's at operating temperature and your car is running, it's closer to that 5 ohm resistance that Mazda said they're supposed to be at with their specifications. All right. So, you know, in the car, this number, the 4K ohms, is going to be 5K at operating temperature. Now, as your plug gets older, that ohm is going to increase. So over time, this starting resistance, instead of it being 4K ohm, is going to be 5, and then 6, and then 7, and then 8, just like the card that I have for the test car. The issue with that is the car already had its baseline set for 4K ohm, right? So as this spark plug is aging and the resistance is going up, the car is lowering timing based off of the change in resistance. So as your resistance get higher, the car over time starts to lower ignition timing, and then it gets slower and slower because its baseline started at 4K, right? And a lot of people always complain about that their stock car over time got slower, and a lot of times that's due to a lot of variables, but one of them being the resistance in the spark plug goes up. And as the resistance goes up, the car continues to think this is its baseline, right? So what you can do to reset your baseline is disconnect the battery or clear your DTCs, and what's going to happen, whatever the spark plug individual resistance is going to reset it to that baseline. So if not all of your spark plugs are all at 6K ohm resistance, it resets it at that as its baseline to for your timing, right? So now all your timing that you initially had with 4K is going to be set to a 6K ohm load, and then it's going to adjust based off of that 6K up or down, whatever it needs to. So that's why a lot of guys, when they put the spark plugs in with no tune, the car gets faster, because not necessarily because the spark plugs are better, it's just because they have a lower resistance, right? So now that timing came back. So the real benefit is not from the ignition timing, guys. The real benefit of the GTR plugs, which I had to explain all that to you first before I get to this, the real benefit of the GTR plugs is they are a heat range higher, right? And yes, there is no need for a heat range 8. You don't need anything. You don't need an intake. You don't need exhaust. You don't even need a tune. But having a heat range 8 is going to be better. And the reason why is because the heat range, a colder plug, what it does, it dissipates heat better, right? If you have a spark plug that dissipates heat better, the plug resistance does not go up as much over time. A spark plug that is constantly hot, the resistance will increase on it over time a lot faster than the plug that dissipates the heat a lot faster. So a heat range 8 versus a heat range 7, the heat range 8 pulls more heat from the plug and into the head, the head of the engine, you know. So instead of that heat staying in the plug, it gets dissipated through the head, all right? And the main benefit of that is, as you're, like, say you're driving on the track, as the resistance of the spark plug goes up, that's due to heat. So when you're driving in the car, you're going through your laps, you've been driving for 30 minutes, the resistance of the heat of the spark plug is gonna keep increasing, right? And as the heat of the spark plug increases, the resistance is gonna increase. So if you're driving around track and your spark plugs are really hot and the resistance is going up, your timing is gonna start dropping and getting lower, right? So why not have a plug that can dissipate heat more, so as you're driving, your timing doesn't get reduced as much? That's the main benefit of having a heat range 8, is being able to dissipate the heat so you don't lose performance as the car gets hotter and I'm making these tunes hotter, all right? Because your stock tune, the AFR gets into the 9s, right? I lean it out, it stays in the 12s and higher, all right? And so that is a lot higher, which means your spark plugs are gonna be generating, they're gonna be in a lot hotter environment, and you're gonna wanna dissipate that heat so your car doesn't start pulling timing, you know? So in the video, when I changed the spark plugs, the car didn't improve 0 to 60, all right? And that's because the spark plugs really shine once the car has fully adapted and learned. And also, as you're driving in the conditions that require, the spark plugs to perform, you're gonna have that benefit. So the runs are more consistent with the GTR plugs. And you prevent power loss with the GTR plugs. But as far as like you gaining power on the GTR plugs, you're not gonna gain power on the GTR plugs unless you're using it to trick the stock tune. Now, like I said, if you had some spark plugs and they were all a 6 and 8K ohm load, and you drop those GTR plugs in there without resetting the ECU, you're gonna jack up, your timing is gonna go through the roof and the car will be faster. So that's the main emphasis in this video, is just the spark plugs do their job. They dissipate more heat, and they won't get burnt out as fast, and that's what we want. So as for the first test, the spark plugs didn't change 0 to 60, guys. The 0 to 60 was exactly the same, but the one thing we did notice, I guess, it wasn't exactly the same. It's just that we noticed the car was not getting slower during the runs. So when we had the stock plugs in, the times would get slower every run. And that was due to more heat. Even though the average was still relatively same, every run with each tune would get slower with the stock plugs. After we changed to the GTR plugs and did the tune runs and the stock runs with the GTR plugs, the time didn't get faster than it was with the initial run with the stock plugs, but the times were more consistent. So with the stock plugs, you could see a steady increase in the 0 to 60 time, like it kept getting slower. And with the GTR plugs, we noticed the first run to the last run, they were consistent all the way through. And even they weren't faster than the stock plugs time. They were exactly the same right in that area. But the average time was better with the GTR plugs because they dissipated heat a little bit better. I don't know. It could have been a fluke, but it was generally showing. Actually, our car was getting faster on some runs with the GTR plugs versus the stock plugs. It consistently got slower. I'm still trying to get all the draggy results from my customer in Texas. He gave me the wrong login, so I'll have those draggy runs in our last video so you guys can physically see the spark plug runs, silicone hose plus spark plug runs, and then the silicone hose, spark plug, and the pump run. And then obviously in that last video, I'm going to show you guys, because there was this big, it wasn't a debate, but there's an argument that the low pump doesn't do anything. It does. All right, and you're gonna see in the last video what it actually does and how it works. Even though it's part of my proprietary tuning, I'm gonna show you guys because I don't think any of you guys want to tune hundreds of cars like this.
The video was way longer than it was supposed to be. And yeah, I couldn't even put the video footage in with it, but the other videos will be more action. But that being said, I know you guys saw that the cover photo. In the next video, I'll give you guys more information about it. There's a giveaway. I'm not making any money from it. I'm just doing it because I just want to support other businesses out there trying to do things. But yeah, spark plugs, they did not make the car faster, but it kept the car from getting slower. So that's it for this video, guys. I'll get you actually 0 to 60 runs so you can see that car move at 9 seconds, 0 to 60, which is not impressive at all. But yeah, that's it for today. Thank you.